All right, let's dive right into this explainer, where we are going to unpack the fascinating mechanics of the simple Keynesian model of income determination. If you're currently studying advanced undergraduate macroeconomics, getting a solid grip on how income, spending, and government policy all interact is absolutely essential. We're going to break down exactly how a single dollar injected into an economy can literally multiply, and, just as importantly, where this entire theoretical framework hits a wall. Let's get started. To really understand how an economy functions in the short run, we have to start with John Maynard Keynes's revolutionary idea. He proposed that it's actually the spending plans of households, businesses, and the government that determine our national income. You see, prior to his 1936 book, The General Theory, the prevailing classical thought was that aggregate supply, so your capital, your labor, your technology, determined national income. Keynes basically flipped this entirely on its head. He argued that inadequate demand is the real culprit behind economic downturns. So, here is our roadmap for today. 1. The core Keynesian cross. 2. The multiplier effect. 3. Government spending and taxes. 4. The balanced budget multiplier. And 5. Critiquing the Keynesian model. Kicking things off with Section 1, the core Keynesian cross, the foundation of income determination. Now, in this model, there's a theoretical sweet spot, a 45-degree line that represents the exact equilibrium point where actual expenditure perfectly equals planned expenditure. Think of it like a balancing scale. If firms produce at a level where planned spending falls short of what's actually being made, well, they end up accumulating a bunch of unwanted inventory, just boxes sitting in a warehouse. This unplanned buildup induces them to cut back on production. Conversely, if planned spending exceeds what's being produced, inventories plummet, which signals firms to ramp up their output. In both of these scenarios, the economy is gravitationally pulled right back to that exact point of equilibrium. Moving right along to Section 2, the multiplier effect. This is really the engine of macroeconomics. The absolutely crucial concept we need to grasp here is the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. This tells us exactly how much of a newly earned dollar will immediately flow right back into the economy as consumption. So if your MPC is 0.8, it means for every extra dollar you earn, you're going to spend 80 cents and save 20 cents. But here's the magic. That 80 cents you just spent, it doesn't just vanish, it becomes someone else's income, driving the entire macroeconomic engine forward. And this creates a brilliant chain reaction. An initial injection of spending creates income, which induces more consumption, which creates an infinite geometric series of economic expansion. It's literally a domino effect. The initial change in autonomous spending triggers a first wave of consumption. But it definitely doesn't stop there. That new consumption triggers a second, slightly smaller wave, calculated as your MPC squared times the initial change, and the cycle just keeps going. Now, if we dust off our algebra and solve that infinite geometric series, we can isolate a very vital formula. It proves that a single dollar of autonomous spending will raise equilibrium income by substantially more than $1. The formula is simply 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. This single mathematical truth is the entire foundation for why governments deploy massive stimulus packages during recessions. Okay, let's look at Section 3, government spending and taxes. Time to pull some fiscal levers. When the government decides to step in and increase purchases, the planned expenditure schedule shifts upward. The distance of that upward shift is your change in government spending. But here's the kicker. The resulting increase in total income is visibly larger than that initial government injection. The gap between the new and old equilibrium income ends up being significantly wider than the actual initial shift itself. Let's put some real numbers on this to give it perspective. Say our marginal propensity to consume is 0.6, while the multiplier formula tells us that a $1 increase in government purchases raises equilibrium income by exactly $2.50. Why? Because 1 minus 0.6 is 0.4, and 1 divided by 0.4 gives us 2.5. This means a government spending program doesn't just replace lost private spending on a one-to-one basis, it actively multiplies as it ripples through the economy. Conversely, taxes also have a multiplier effect. But because an income tax initially reduces disposable income rather than directly reducing expenditure, the tax multiplier is actually negative and slightly smaller in magnitude. The math is negative MPC over 1 minus MPC. Think about it. If the government cuts your taxes by $1, you don't instantly spend that whole dollar. You're going to save a little piece of it. Therefore, the initial punch to aggregate demand is just a bit weaker than if the government had just spent that dollar directly themselves. Which brings us to Section 4, the balanced budget multiplier. This is where things get highly counterintuitive. So ask yourself this: what happens if an increase in government spending is exactly offset by an equal increase in taxes? You might logically assume that if the government taxes away a dollar for every dollar it spends, the net effect on equilibrium income would be exactly zero, right? It feels like it should be a wash. But actually, scratch that. That assumption is totally wrong. When we look closely at the math, because the change in output has to equal the change in aggregate demand, we impose the strict constraint that the change in taxes equals the change in government spending. Therefore, the change in total income equals the initial government injection, plus the induced consumption that results from the change in income after you've accounted for those new taxes. And the math reveals something amazing. The balanced budget multiplier is exactly 1. This means an increase in government spending funded entirely by an equal increase in taxes will still raise overall output by the exact amount of the initial government spending. Why does this happen? Well, the government spends 100% of the tax dollar it collects, but the taxpayer who gave up that dollar was only ever going to spend a fraction of it, their marginal propensity to consume. By forcibly transferring a dollar from a partial saver to a total spender, the government effectively forces a net increase in aggregate demand. Finally, Section 5, critiquing the Keynesian model. We need to define the theoretical boundaries. Here is the catch with everything we just walked through. The entire Keynesian model heavily relies on the assumption that prices are entirely stuck or fixed. It assumes that spending alone dictates output. If firms see more demand, these supposedly just produce more stuff without raising their prices. Classical theory, on the other hand, argues that flexible prices will inevitably adjust to ensure national income stays right at its natural level. In the classical view, if you just pump up demand with government spending, firms won't blindly produce more forever. Eventually, they're simply going to jack up their prices. So as you review these formulas, here's the million-dollar question to leave you with. Does active stabilization policy genuinely fix the economy, or does this assumption of sticky prices blind us to the long-term consequences of stimulated demand? Are we just buying an illusion of growth today at the cost of crippling inflation tomorrow? This debate between short-term Keynesian intervention and long-term classical price adjustment is quite literally the defining tension of macroeconomics. The multiplier undeniably shows us the power of induced spending, but policymakers have to decide if the inflation trade-off is worth it. Keep that theoretical boundary in mind as you continue your studies.